My name is Cynthia, a 30-year-old ER nurse in Seattle where endless night shifts and the clinical stench of antiseptics have eroded the very years of my youth. For the past 12 months, I have ceased to live for myself. I have existed merely as a money-making machine to sustain my sister's fleeting breath following her grim cancer diagnosis. Every single month, I have scraped together every cent of my meager wages, sacrificing my own sustenance and comfort to wire exactly $1,600 back to Florida, trading my stability and simplest dreams just to buy a flicker of hope through grueling, life-saving chemotherapy sessions. This evening, amidst the drenching and bone-chilling Seattle rain, I slumped hopelessly over my steering wheel as I listened to my mother's voice over the phone, a voice trembling with a calculated desperation as she pleaded that costs had surged and that my blood-earned contribution was no longer enough. I sat there, my eyes sunken from sleep deprivation, my thumb hovering tremulously over the transfer button in an abyss of guilt, for these were the very last coins I had saved to rescue my own bleak future. But then a call from Derek, my brother-in-law, dealt a fatal blow to the last of my crumbling strength. With a voice breathless and haunted, he begged me to stop and urged me to look into my mother's secret savings records before I allowed my hard-earned wages to continue falling into a bottomless black hole. In that moment, my reality shattered. A sickening and bitter suspicion began to crawl up my spine, reminding me that perhaps my sister's survival was nothing more than a pretext for a betrayal far more cruel. If this pain and ultimate deception strike a chord within your heart, please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell right now to stand by me on this journey of exposing this bitter truth. Your support is the only solace helping me stay upright, so please leave a comment to share your thoughts with me as we strip away the darkest secrets of this family. 15 years ago, the heart-wrenching blare of sirens at the Seattle docks signaled a catastrophic crane failure, effectively crushing my childhood before it could even truly take shape. Dad was the sole anchor holding the family ship from sinking, but his agonizing death in that horrific industrial accident forced me to discard my medical school dreams to become a primary money-making machine at just 18 years old. Mom, that woman named Dolores, immediately wove a perfect psychological trap by crafting the image of a far too fragile Brenda, a creature who could not survive without my constant bone-deep protection. While I buried my youth scrubbing pungent hospital floors and facing the grim reality of the emergency room, Brenda remained tucked away in the comfort of Florida, completely immune to every financial storm. I still vividly remember Mom sitting me down right after the funeral to instill the belief that because I was the strong one, ensuring my sister never tasted hardship was the most sacred faith I had to worship. This brutal, emotional manipulation wore the mask of family bonds, but looking back, it was the day I signed a contract of lifelong invisible servitude. For 10 grueling years of being eroded to the point of exhaustion, I imprisoned myself in a damp, dilapidated studio apartment in the dark alleys of Seattle just to cut out 70% of my income to send home for those bottomless, greedy bills. My hospital shifts often lasted 16 hours, where I was besieged by the cold scent of clinical antiseptics and the haunting silence of the night ward. While colleagues of my age were glowing with promotion plans or dream weddings, I was slumped over, calculating how many extra hours I had to wring out to provide for the extravagant lifestyle Mom insisted Brenda was entitled to by default. Brenda naturally viewed my total sacrifice as a self-evident service that the entire universe had to provide for her personal luxury. She never once had to endure the toil of labor or the pain of tightening one's belt, as Mom always prioritized Brenda's frivolous demands over my most basic survival needs. Even when my body shivered violently from exhaustion during our weekly calls, Mom would nonchalantly spend the entire hour listing the new designer items Brenda needed to soothe the pain of losing her father. Whenever I cried out for help regarding the fatigue that had reached its breaking point, Mom would use masterclass manipulation techniques to steer the conversation back to Brenda's sensitive emotional state or some self-created minor ailment that required immediate financial resolution. I was nothing more than a living ATM, a biological entity operating on caffeine and crumbling willpower while my family basked in the Florida sunshine on my sweat and tears. There were long nights when I stood frozen before the hospital bathroom mirror, looking at my gaunt face and wondering if I would ever be allowed to live a life of meaning for myself. Seattle, in my eyes, was a magnificent prison where I worked until my hands were cracked just to maintain a fake middle-class facade for two people who never bothered to care if I was dead or alive. Brenda's social media was a lavish exhibition of afternoon tea parties and trendy outfits, all traded for the miserable overtime hours I spent cleaning the blood and wounds of trauma patients. Mom's voice never carried a hint of warm concern for my health. It was only a cold demand for the next payment to keep Brenda's paradise from collapsing. As the years blurred in exhaustion, the family dynamic transformed into a treacherous loop where my depletion was the primary lifeblood nourishing their laziness and leisure. Mom constantly used Dad's soul to torment me by reminding me that he would have wanted me to take care of his favorite girl, turning the memory of the deceased into a weapon to choke any spark of resentment in my heart. There was one time Brenda called to complain that her bedroom furniture was outdated, while she remained completely oblivious that I was sleeping on a rotting secondhand mattress smelling of mildew because I had no money for a replacement. I painfully realized that the label "strong one" was merely a linguistic tool to legitimize my exploitation to the bone by the very people I called kin. The hospital became my only reality, a place where strangers sometimes granted me more respect than my own flesh and blood ever deigned to give. Every time a paycheck landed, I felt only a fleeting spark of relief before being crushed by the horror that the entire sum would be seized in just a few heartbeats. This toxic behavioral pattern was so deeply embedded in my consciousness that I once blindly believed I was fulfilling a noble mission by personally incinerating my own future for their sake. Brenda never had to taste the fear of rent or medical bills, for Mom had reflexively fastened all those yokes around my neck without a shred of pity. I often had to stomach hunger at the end of the month because the emergency expenses Mom invented always weirdly matched the final coins I had left for myself. Friends in Seattle gradually vanished from my life because they understood I would never have a single cent for even a simple dinner, while they still saw Brenda flaunting new designer bags every week on social media. Mom's manipulation was so vicious that it made me feel like a criminal if I dared think of keeping a little extra to buy a new pair of shoes or travel. The voluntary bondage I accepted for the sake of family blood was silently slaughtering my spirit, leaving behind a hollow shell with a professional title and a cold, empty ache in my chest. Looking back at those 10 years of unremitting forced labor, I see the image of a pitiful woman who, out of a desperate thirst for her mother's approval, allowed herself to be bled dry until she withered. Brenda remained the center of the universe, a pampered princess whose every irrational demand became a royal decree that I was expected to fulfill with my very life and absolute grit. Dad's death was merely a pretext, but Mom's morbid favoritism was the true architect that built the iron cage imprisoning me in double shifts under the cold Seattle rain. I was so exhausted that I didn't realize Brenda had morphed from a grieving teenager into a professional parasite, one who was flourishing on the destruction of her own sister. This contract of servitude never contained love. It was a cruel scheme to ensure Mom and Brenda never had to touch the harsh reality of losing Dad's income. Every dollar I sent to Florida was a brick in the wall they were building between me and the life of freedom I truly deserved. The cold smell of antiseptics and the relentless rhythm of night shifts became my only companions during those long, lonely years of carrying a family that viewed me as a utility rather than a human being. I became a master at suffocating my own needs, crushed by Mom's curse that I was the only one who could keep the family from falling apart. Brenda's silken life was a sanctuary built on the ruins of my youth, a fact Mom always celebrated as a symbol of family resilience. I had sunk so deep into this mire that every time I thought of saying no, I felt like a traitor to Dad's memory and every moral value I had been taught. Even as my health declined and the chronic back pain of nursing began to haunt me every night, the demands from Florida continued to pour down with even more brutal intensity. This was the silkworm's fate. I had accepted a path of giving until the final breath, where the only reward was the bitterness of realizing I had just satisfied one more thirst of bottomless greed. 12 months ago, the fragile peace of a Sunday morning was shattered by a frantic video call from Brenda, the opening shot that marked my freefall into the abyss of financial ruin. She appeared on my flickering phone screen with a black silk scarf wrapped tightly around her head, her face appearing artificially pale and devoid of its usual vitality, as she tearfully claimed that doctors had just diagnosed her with stage 3 cancer. Before I could even process the horrific news, Mom snatched the phone away with theatrically trembling hands, her eyes red as if on cue, as she began wailing about a life-or-death crisis requiring an astronomical amount of money for specialized treatments. The atmosphere in their Florida home, even through the digital screen, felt suffocatingly heavy as they showcased a bedside table cluttered with various pill bottles and medical equipment they claimed were the chains tethering Brenda to life. Mom insisted that the only hope for Brenda to escape death's door lay in an experimental chemotherapy protocol administered by a prestigious specialist named Dr. Sterling. It was during that heart-wrenching conversation that Mom established a non-negotiable monthly quota of $1,600, emphasizing with a razor-sharp tone that this specific sum was the absolute minimum required to keep Brenda's fading soul from leaving her body. Within weeks, professional-looking invoices bearing Dr. Sterling's signature began to rain down upon my email inbox with terrifying regularity. These documents were filled with complex medical jargon and staggering figures for specialized infusions that made my head spin every time I dared to touch the attachments. I spent my long, grueling night shifts in a state of bone-deep anxiety, staring at the ward clock and frantically calculating exactly how many extra hours I needed to wring out just to cover the next medication cycle. Mom would often call me during my rare 15-minute breaks, her voice dripping with a calculated desperation as she described the agonizing pain Brenda supposedly endured during her latest round of chemo. Every time I begged to fly down and visit so I could support them in person, Mom skillfully blocked the request by claiming Brenda was far too exhausted and humiliated by her physical deterioration to let anyone see her. She cold-bloodedly manipulated me into believing that my presence would only cause more stress, forcing me to show my love through the cold numbers on banking apps instead of a warm embrace. The financial pressure became so immense that I was forced to sell my only car and sign off on high-interest personal loans just to satisfy their bottomless greed under the guise of daughterly devotion. I moved to a dilapidated, more isolated apartment and began surviving on prepackaged noodles, blindly believing that my own suffering was a small price to pay to keep my sister from the grave. Mom would periodically send me grainy, dimly lit photos of Brenda lying in a darkened room, surrounded by medical monitors and IV drips that I now realize were likely nothing more than elaborately staged cheap props purchased online. Whenever I dared to question the specifics of the protocol or requested to speak with Dr. Sterling directly, Mom would immediately gaslight me, accusing me of being heartless, skeptical, and cold-blooded during our family's darkest hour. She ruthlessly turned my professional knowledge as a nurse against me, arguing that my clinical questioning was proof of a withered heart rather than a worried sibling. My life in Seattle became a monotonous blur of forced labor as I slowly transformed into a hollow shell of a human being, whose only purpose was to bleed myself dry to generate cash for a fabricated tragedy occurring thousands of miles away. As the months dragged on, the demands for additional funds for unforeseen complications, or emergency blood transfusions, became a daily ritual that I met with blind obedience. I was imprisoned by the very guilt they had manufactured, never stopping to wonder why Brenda's voice sounded remarkably strong during our brief nightly check-ins. Every single dollar I earned through blood, sweat, and tears was instantly swallowed by the black hole of their staged medical crisis in Jacksonville. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of fabricated invoices and forged medical reports, yet the fear of Brenda's death forced me to keep swimming against a tide that was designed to sink me. Mom continued to fuel the fire of my anxiety by describing Brenda's fragile state in gruesome detail, ensuring that I stayed in a constant state of panic that prevented any rational investigation. I became a ghost in my own life, avoiding friends and social circles, because I had no energy left for anything other than working and wiring money to the two parasites who were systematically destroying my future. The manipulation reached a peak when Mom claimed that Brenda's insurance had completely denied coverage for a life-saving drug, leaving us with a staggering bill that had to be paid within 48 hours. I remember sitting on the cold floor of my apartment staring at the wall in total despair before calling a predatory lender just to get the funds they demanded with such practiced urgency. I was sacrificing my credit score, my health, and my very soul for a play that Mom and Brenda were polishing every single day with professional cunning. Brenda's performance as the dying victim was so flawless that I spent many nights crying myself to sleep, praying to a God I had long forgotten to spare her life. Meanwhile, Mom was likely laughing in the background as she calculated the next way to exploit my empathy and my unwavering sense of duty to our late father. This was the dark reality of our cancer campaign, a sophisticated web of lies where my genuine love was the primary currency being spent on their hidden luxuries. 2 weeks after the haunting warning from Derek, I finally reached a breaking point where the suffocating weight of suspicion outweighed my fear of being discovered. I managed to secure a few days of emergency leave from the hospital and booked a last-minute flight to Jacksonville without uttering a single word to Mom or Brenda about my intentions. Upon landing in the sweltering Florida heat, I felt like a spy in my own life as I navigated toward a budget car rental counter while keeping my baseball cap pulled low over my eyes. I spent the first few hours of my arrival sitting in that cramped rental car parked a block away from our family home, my heart hammering against my ribs with a mixture of dread and agonizing anticipation. The familiar suburban street looked disturbingly peaceful in the morning sun, showing no outward signs of the medical battlefield I had been funding with my lifeblood for an entire year. I watched from behind the tinted glass as the neighborhood woke up, waiting for any sign that would either confirm my worst fears or prove my brother-in-law was mistaken. The first crack in their elaborate mask appeared at precisely 10 o'clock when a high-end delivery van pulled into the driveway with a flourish that felt entirely out of place for a house of mourning. I watched in stunned silence as a courier unloaded a stack of oversized boxes, adorned with the logos of luxury fashion brands that I could never dream of affording on my nursing salary. My breath hitched in my throat when the front door swung open, and Brenda herself stepped out onto the porch, appearing remarkably vibrant and energetic, for someone allegedly in the throes of aggressive chemotherapy. She was wearing a stylish designer sundress, and her movements were fluid and graceful, showing none of the frailty or physical agony that Mom had described so vividly during our nightly phone calls. There was no sign of the silk scarf she usually wore during our video chats, and her hair looked thick and professionally styled as she laughed and joked with the delivery driver. I felt a surge of cold fury rising within me as I watched her sign for the packages with a steady hand, a hand that supposedly trembled with the effort of holding a spoon just 48 hours ago. Later that afternoon, I observed Mom emerging from the house to join Brenda on the porch, both of them appearing relaxed and cheerful as they examined the contents of the new delivery. They were sipping on what looked like expensive bottled water and sharing a plate of gourmet snacks, their faces glowing with a health that felt like a direct insult to my year of sacrifice. I witnessed Mom leaning in to whisper something in Brenda's ear that sent both of them into fits of laughter, a sound that echoed painfully in my mind against the memory of Mom's manufactured sobs. The garden was meticulously maintained, and the exterior of the house looked freshly painted, likely funded by the thousands of dollars I had sent for emergency home modifications to accommodate a wheelchair that was nowhere to be seen. I felt a sickening realization that the darkened rooms and medical equipment I saw during our video calls were nothing more than a carefully curated set designed to manipulate my empathy. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to storm onto the porch and demand an explanation for their monstrous betrayal. As evening approached, the situation became even more grotesque when a group of well-dressed people arrived at the house carrying bottles of premium wine and trays of expensive catering. I watched from my hiding spot as a full-scale dinner party began to unfold, with music drifting through the open windows and the distinct smell of grilled lobster filling the humid Florida air. Brenda was the life of the party, moving effortlessly among the guests and raising a glass of champagne with a radiant smile that felt like a jagged blade in my chest. Mom was acting as the perfect hostess, her face devoid of any trace of the caregiver fatigue she had used to guilt me into sending extra funds for her own mental health. I recorded several minutes of the festivities on my phone, my vision blurred by tears of rage, as I documented the very people I was supposed to be saving through my own poverty. Every laugh shared on that porch was a testament to their absolute contempt for my labor and the father's memory they had so ruthlessly exploited. I remained in the car until the last guest departed and the house finally went dark, my mind racing with the sheer scale of the deception they had maintained for 12 long months. The clinical smell of the Seattle ER felt a million miles away from this den of luxury and lies, yet it was the only reason this lifestyle was possible for them. I felt a profound sense of isolation as I realized that the two people who were supposed to be my closest family were actually my most dangerous predators. The betrayal was not just about the money, it was about the systematic destruction of my youth and my sanity for the sake of their frivolous vanity. I spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, staring at the ceiling and replaying the images of Brenda's vibrant health over and over in my head. I knew that the time for quiet observation was over, and that I needed to find concrete evidence that would hold up in a court of law. Tomorrow, I would meet Derek in secret to uncover the final pieces of this puzzle and prepare for a confrontation that would change everything forever. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the derelict gas station on the outskirts of Jacksonville looked like a scene from a nightmare, illuminated only by the flickering neon of a broken sign. I waited in the shadows until a battered pickup truck pulled into the lot, and Derek stepped out with the haunted expression of a man who had spent far too long living in a house of mirrors. He was visibly trembling as he reached into his jacket to produce a small blue savings book that Mom had kept hidden in a double-locked drawer for years. Derek whispered that he could no longer live with the crushing weight of the secret, especially after seeing how my life in Seattle was being systematically dismantled for their pleasure. I opened the book under the dim interior light of my car, my eyes blurring as I traced the long list of $1,600 deposits that I had sacrificed my youth to provide. Every single transaction was followed by immediate withdrawals to fund down payments on luxury vehicles and a series of elective plastic surgery procedures for Brenda. The raw betrayal of seeing my hard-earned wages converted into cosmetic enhancements while I skipped meals was a physical blow that left me gasping for air in the humid night. Derek leaned against the window, his voice thick with a mixture of pity and agonizing guilt, as he revealed the most revolting detail of their grand scheme. He explained that Brenda's frequent emergency therapy trips were actually lavish vacations to Las Vegas, where she used my money to support a young lover she had met online. While I was holding the hands of dying patients in the ER and working 3 consecutive double shifts, my sister was dancing in exclusive clubs and staying in 5-star suites on my dime. Derek handed me a flash drive containing dozens of photos he had recovered from the family computer showing Brenda glowing with health and expensive jewelry in the middle of a casino floor. The dates on the digital timestamps perfectly coincided with the weeks I had spent crying myself to sleep over her supposed terminal decline. My heart, which had been breaking for a year out of love for my sister, began to harden into a cold and impenetrable block of granite as the full scale of their depravity was laid bare. Driven by a cold and calculated fury, I returned to the house after Mom had fallen into a deep sleep and quietly scaled the pull-down ladder to the dusty attic. I discovered a literal workshop of deception tucked away behind some old holiday decorations, complete with professional-grade printers and stacks of high-quality parchment paper. There were several rubber stamps featuring the names of various doctors, including the elusive Dr. Sterling, which Mom had apparently purchased from untraceable vendors on the dark web. I found a folder filled with half-finished drafts of medical invoices, where they had practiced forging signatures to make the documents appear authentic enough to fool a medical professional like myself. The expensive cancer medications that Mom had displayed with such pride were actually nothing more than cheap herbal supplements with clumsily printed labels glued over the original packaging. Every single element of Brenda's illness was a carefully constructed prop in a play that had cost me my sanity and every cent of my savings. I stood in that sweltering attic surrounded by the physical remains of their lies and realized that my family was nothing more than a criminal enterprise disguised as a household. Mom had used my father's memory as a leash to keep me compliant, while she and Brenda picked my pockets with the precision of seasoned pickpockets. I took high-resolution photos of every stamp, every forged invoice, and every bottle of fake medication, documenting the evidence that would eventually put an end to their parasitic existence. The silence of the house below felt heavy and ominous, filled with the breathing of 2 predators who were dreaming of how to spend the next installment of my blood money. I felt a profound sense of relief as the last of my illusions vanished, replaced by a sharp and focused determination to ensure they paid for every minute of my suffering. The girl who had left Seattle to save her sister was dead, and in her place stood a woman who was ready to burn the house of lies to the ground. Derek had promised to testify if it came to a legal battle, but I knew that I wanted to witness their downfall with my own eyes before the authorities were ever involved. I climbed down from the attic and slipped back out into the night, the blue savings book tucked safely against my chest like a shield. The humid Florida air no longer felt suffocating, as the clarity of the truth had given me a renewed sense of purpose and a cold, unwavering strength. I spent the remaining hours of the night in my rental car staring at the photos of Brenda dancing in Vegas while I had been bleeding for her survival. The betrayal was absolute, but the power dynamic had finally shifted in my favor, and I was no longer the victim in their twisted game. Tomorrow I would begin setting the ultimate trap that would force them to reveal their true colors in front of everyone they had ever manipulated. The time for tears was over, and the time for a cold and calculated justice had finally arrived. 6 days after discovering the horrifying truth in the attic, I initiated the final stage of my retaliation by calling Mom with a voice filled with a manufactured excitement that I had practiced hundreds of times in front of my bathroom mirror. I kept my breathing shallow and my tone high-pitched as I announced that Dad's old industrial accident insurance policy had just released a massive supplemental compensation payment totaling $60,000. The reaction from Brenda and Mom was as instantaneous as it was terrifying, as they both seemed to completely forget about Brenda's supposed physical agony in their desperate rush to demand an immediate cash transfer. Their voices through the speaker were thick with a predatory hunger that made my skin crawl, yet I continued to play the role of the dutiful and gullible daughter who was eager to share this newfound fortune. I carefully set a non-negotiable condition that the entire family had to meet at the most expensive steakhouse in the city to sign the final transfer documents in person. The sheer greed radiating from their responses confirmed that they were completely blind to the cold and calculated fury simmering just beneath my cheerful facade. While they were busy picking out their most expensive outfits for our celebratory dinner, I was working secretly with my lawyer Marcus to prepare a different set of legal papers. Marcus was a sharp and experienced professional who understood the gravity of the interstate fraud they had committed against me over the last decade. Instead of the massive settlement check they were expecting to see on the table, Marcus drafted a formal criminal complaint and a mountain of evidence that would expose their web of lies to the authorities. I also maintained constant contact with Derek, who was quietly gathering his own belongings and preparing divorce papers to leave that house of deception the moment the truth was finally revealed. We operated like a specialized tactical team, ensuring that every exit was blocked and every lie was documented before we stepped into the restaurant for the final showdown. The psychological chains that had bound me to their whims for so long were finally turning into the very shackles that would lead them to their own destruction. On the night of the meeting, the atmosphere in the luxury steakhouse was a grotesque display of their absolute contempt for my labor and my father's memory. Mom and Brenda were already waiting in the lobby dressed in flamboyant designer clothing that I had unknowingly paid for through my grueling hospital shifts in Seattle. They looked remarkably healthy and vibrant, with Brenda showing no signs of the fatigue or illness she had used to manipulate my bank account for an entire year. The greedy sparkle in their eyes as they greeted me was a sickening testament to how easily they could discard their humanity for the sake of a few $1,000s. I felt an icy calmness settle over my heart as I watched them laugh and discuss the expensive bottles of wine they planned to order once the paperwork was signed. They were so blinded by the flashing lights of potential wealth that they failed to notice the presence of Marcus sitting at a nearby table with a heavy briefcase full of their own sins. I led them to our private booth in the back of the restaurant, maintaining a polite and submissive demeanor that encouraged their arrogant behavior. Brenda began to complain about the lighting being too bright for her sensitive eyes, a final pathetic attempt to maintain her victim persona, even as she reached for the leather-bound menu. I watched Mom adjust her expensive silk scarf with a smug expression, clearly believing that she had successfully orchestrated the ultimate financial victory over her own child. The disconnect between their cheerful expectations and the cold reality waiting in my folder was so vast that it almost made me want to laugh out loud. Every word they spoke was a further indictment of their character, strengthening my resolve to ensure that they would never be able to hurt another human being again. I was no longer the frightened girl who had lost her father at 18, but a woman who was about to reclaim her life through a calculated and public execution of their lies. As we sat down, I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick stack of documents that Marcus had prepared with such meticulous care. I could see their hands physically trembling with anticipation as they leaned forward to get a better look at what they believed was a life-changing check. The silence at the table was heavy with their unspoken greed, a suffocating weight that was about to be lifted from my shoulders forever. I caught Derek's eye as he walked through the front door of the restaurant looking stronger and more determined than I had ever seen him during his marriage to Brenda. The stage was perfectly set for a performance that they would never forget, and the audience was already in place to witness their spectacular downfall. I felt a surge of cold and unwavering strength as I prepared to reveal the true nature of the papers resting on the white tablecloth. The time for deception was over, and the era of my absolute freedom was about to begin with a single movement of my hand. Here is the precise English translation of Part 7, crafted with razor-sharp vocabulary and the cold, cynical tone characteristic of high-stakes American drama. At exactly 7 o'clock on Saturday evening, the glittering chandeliers of the upscale steakhouse cast a deceptive glow over the final gathering of a family already rotted to its core. Brenda arrived at our table, pushed in a wheelchair she absolutely did not need, yet she had the sickening audacity to wear a sparkling diamond necklace purchased with the very lifeblood I had bled to send her just last month. I greeted them with a meticulously measured smile masking the freezing cold fury that was icing my veins as I watched them settle into their seats with eyes glittering with greed. Before tossing out the imaginary $60,000, I calmly requested that Brenda recount every excruciating detail of her physical agony so that I could truly memorialize her resilience. With the prowess of a first-rate actress, she leaned forward to weave a fabricated indictment of desperate nights and brutal chemotherapy, her voice dripping with a theatrical sorrow that made the bile rise in my throat. I watched Mom nod in solemn agreement with every blatant lie, her face a mask of manufactured grief, while her eyes constantly darted toward the leather briefcase beside my chair like a vulture circling its prey. As Brenda reached the climax of her fictional struggle, I opened my briefcase with a cold, deliberate slowness that commanded their total predatory attention. Instead of the massive settlement check they hungered for, I began pulling out stacks of original bank statements and high-resolution photos of Brenda's wild, hedonistic nights in Las Vegas. I fanned the incriminating images across the pristine white tablecloth like a deck of fate, exposing my sister dancing hysterically on tables and laughing while clutching expensive cocktails in the middle of a crowded casino. The silence that fell over our booth was so heavy and suffocating that it felt as though the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the restaurant. Brenda's face turned from a sickly pale to a stained, humiliated crimson as she stared at the undeniable proof of her radiant health and her own revolting betrayal. Mom let out a gasp that was entirely forced, her eyes darting frantically between the photos and the disgusted glares of the diners at the neighboring tables. The gold-plated mask of motherly devotion shattered into 1,000 jagged shards when Mom suddenly fell to her knees on the expensive carpeted floor. But she didn't kneel to beg for forgiveness for her crimes. She knelt to wail hysterically while pointing a trembling finger directly at Brenda's horrified face. She begged me to believe that she was merely a pawn, manipulated by Brenda's demands, that she had only participated in the scheme because she was being blackmailed with the threat of isolation. Mom cold-bloodedly claimed that Brenda had coerced her into the deception, threatening to leave her destitute if she did not help facilitate the brutal financial exploitation of her own sister. It was a grotesque display of cowardice that laid bare the parasitic nature of their relationship as the woman who raised me prepared to sacrifice her own child to save herself. The guests around us began to stare with absolute loathing, whispering openly about the human trash unfolding in the middle of such an elegant establishment. Brenda reacted to this betrayal by her own mother with a throat-shredding scream of pure, unadulterated rage that echoed off the high ceilings like a confession. She stood up from her wheelchair with an agility that proved her entire physical condition had been a morbid fabrication from the very beginning. She shouted at the top of her lungs that Mom had been the true mastermind, the one who meticulously forged the hospital invoices using the professional equipment I had found in the attic. Brenda venomously revealed that Mom had taken a significant cut of every single payment I sent, using the money to drown her personal debts and fund her own secret luxuries. They began to tear into each other like starving animals, hurling accusations and revealing the dark mechanics of their year-long conspiracy in front of a room full of strangers. I sat there in petrified silence, watching the two people I had once given my life to protect, destroy what little remained of their dignity for the sake of base survival. Derek stepped out from the shadows of the lobby and walked toward our table with a set of divorce papers clutched like a final verdict. He placed the documents directly in front of Brenda, his eyes filled with a cold and final disappointment that silenced her mid-scream. Marcus approached from the other side of the restaurant to hand Mom a formal notice of the criminal charges being filed for interstate fraud and financial abuse. I felt a cold wave of relief as the shackles of their manipulation finally crumbled from my exhausted shoulders, replaced by a clarity that was as sharp as it was ruthless. I stood up from the table without granting them another word, leaving them to drown in the filth of their own creation while security began to close in. My heart had officially turned to stone, and as I walked out of that restaurant, I knew that the version of me they had exploited was long dead, and the woman walking out today would never look back. The relentless roar of the Atlantic Ocean now serves as the only soundtrack to my mornings, a stark contrast to the chaotic sirens that once defined my existence in Seattle. Standing on the balcony of my new apartment in Savannah, I finally inhale a breath of air that does not taste like antiseptic or the bitter ash of betrayal. Federal investigators moved with a terrifying efficiency following the dinner, officially indicting Brenda and Dolores on multiple counts of wire fraud and financial exploitation involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. The glamorous facade they built on the foundation of my youth crumbled instantly when the bank moved to foreclose on the Florida house due to massive, undisclosed debts. Seeing the photos of the eviction notice taped to that freshly painted front door brought a cold sense of closure that no hollow apology could ever provide. Derek contacted me last week to share that the court had granted him full custody of the children, effectively shielding those innocent souls from the toxic influence of their mother. He has already relocated to a quiet town in the Midwest to start over, leaving Brenda to face the mounting criminal charges without a single ally left in her corner. Marcus coordinated flawlessly with the authorities to ensure that every forged invoice and fake medical report I discovered in the attic was used to its full legal potential. Watching the grainy news footage of Mom being led away in handcuffs felt like watching a total stranger suffer the consequences of a lifetime of calculated greed. There was no flicker of the old daughterly devotion left in my heart, only a profound silence where the echoes of their manufactured crises used to reside. The legal system is finally stripping away their dignity with the same surgical precision they used to strip away my financial stability for over a decade. The restitution process has already begun to funnel back a portion of the stolen funds, allowing me to invest in my own professional advancement for the first time since I was 18. I no longer wake up in a cold sweat checking my banking apps to see if I have enough left to survive the week after their demands are met. The silence of my phone is perhaps the greatest luxury I have ever owned, as the constant barrage of guilt-tripping texts and fake emergency calls has finally ceased forever. Every dollar I earn now belongs to my future rather than being sacrificed to fund the secret Las Vegas vacations or cosmetic surgeries of a professional parasite. My hands, which used to tremble from sheer exhaustion and chronic stress, are now steady as I prepare for my upcoming certification as a specialized surgical consultant. Looking back at the wreckage of my former life, I realize that my mistake was not in being kind, but in allowing my loyalty to be weaponized by people who never truly loved me. The version of Cynthia who was willing to set herself on fire to keep others warm has been buried beneath the weight of the evidence I gathered in that Florida attic. I have learned the expensive lesson that blood ties are not a valid excuse for slavery, and that boundaries are the only defense against those who view empathy as a weakness to be exploited. Brenda and Mom will likely spend the next several years behind bars, a fate that is entirely of their own making, and one that I will not spend a single second trying to alleviate. My father's memory is finally at peace because I am no longer being destroyed in his name, and that realization provides a comfort that no amount of money could ever buy. The sun begins to climb higher over the coastal horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet that seem to promise a life filled with genuine light. I am no longer a ghost haunting my own life, but a woman standing firmly on her own 2 feet, with a clear path stretching out before her. There are no more fake cancer campaigns to fund, no more predatory lenders to fear, and no more manipulative mothers to satisfy. The weight of the world has been lifted from my shoulders, leaving me feeling lighter than I ever thought possible in this lifetime. I turn away from the balcony and step back into my quiet, peaceful home, ready to embrace the first day of the rest of my life. My journey through the darkness has finally ended, and the justice I fought so hard to achieve has cleared the way for a future that is entirely my own.